A long time ago in a faraway land, a young, extremely handsome man who had had no children before found himself falling in love with an older woman who was a mother of one, much to the mortification of his family. The two met one afternoon when the young man Farai, who was a respected warrior in the king's army, intentionally lagged behind in the forest as his compatriots marched home from a successful hunt. He had always dreaded walking into the kingdom, lugging an elephant and a buffalo and kudus and impalas and rabbits because people would be waiting for them, and he would be phoned on over and over until he was tired. So he had always allowed all the warriors to walk in, and when the crowds had quieted and retreated back to their homes, he would surreptitiously slip into the village and walk home alone. So now he had wandered off alone into the forest, hoping to find a honeycomb to feed his desire for something sweet and quench the saltiness from his tongue for all the meat they had eaten in the 2 weeks they had been away from home. And there he had met something sweeter, his sweetheart. Farai's first glimpse of her was the outline of a hunched back that was heaving heavily up and down, and he had known immediately that the woman was crying. With all the kindness he could summon in his voice, he said to her softly, "Ma'am, are you all right?" She jumped then, putting as much distance between the two of them as she could, and even though he could see the wetness on her cheeks, there was a strong defiance in her eyes and in her body that he knew she was ready to fight at any moment. He also saw how quickly her hand had reached for her waist, where in the waistband of her skirts he could see a spear's hilt. But he also saw her pet face, her big eyes, her high cheekbones, and the thick lips that gave her face character, but which were now pulled so tight he could sense her anger from a distance. Immediately he put his hands up to show that he meant no harm, but she did not relax. "I am sorry," he said quickly. "I just saw you crying and I thought you needed help." She whispered in an unintelligible voice, but he heard what she said anyway. "Go away." But he could not leave, and remained standing there as though he had been frozen by an enchantment, and simply staring at the beauty that stood before him. Mucha, realizing that the young man who looked like a warrior was not listening to her, and also feeling uneasy in the presence of a man while she was alone in the forest, quickly glanced from one side to the other to find a clear path before hoisting her skirts and fleeing into the forest. She ran, forcing air into her lungs, holding her skirts higher as she jumped boulders and rocks and fallen tree trunks, and forcing her mind to not forget the way home, as these were unconventional paths that she had taken. A part of her thought she could hear the warrior's footsteps following her, but she did not dare look back, for she feared losing momentum or, even worse, tumbling down the hill she ran through. Only when she started to hear the sounds of the kingdom before her and knew she was almost home did she allow herself to slow down, take much-needed gulps of air into her lungs, and look back to see if the young man had followed her. She breathed a sigh of relief. He had not, and she was glad to be back safely home. But even as she took a step closer into the village, remembrance flooded her mind, and a part of her wanted to sit down and cry again. But she knew that the time for crying was gone, interrupted by that warrior, and now she had to be strong and face the world and face her problems again. She tried not to think much as she walked into her village and greeted her neighbors as she walked past, thinking only of her daughter and how she, Mucha, had to try hard to survive for the sake of the young girl. Back in the forest, however, Farai had of course followed the young woman, drawn to her as though she were a magnet, wanting to stop her, to talk to her. He had known he could outrun her, but the sane part of him was already telling him it was creepy to follow a woman, and he had to keep his distance. So once she had slowed down, he had hid behind a tree and watched as the bravery she had shown at the glade seeped out of her body, and she began to look burdened and defeated again before she disappeared into her village. He knew why he had never seen her before now. She came from the poor and forgotten villages by the end of the kingdom, and thus there was no fraternization between them and his affluent family. As he walked back home, however, Farai tried to avoid the areas where he might meet people, mostly young women and their mothers. The young man had gained widespread notoriety in the kingdom for his prowess as a warrior when he had charged against a group of raiders in the kingdom and, with the help of the rest of the army, annihilated the leaders of the rogue bandits. The king had given him a badge of honor, and he had risen in the ranks of the army to a supervisorial level. It did not help, too, that he came from a family of distinguished, wealthy farmers, and that year after year after year, his parents, as his grandparents before them, and his great-grandparents before them, filled sheds upon shades with grain even during times of drought. So he was a good catch, and mothers and daughters were sure of the security he would provide once married. So daily he was subjected to the preening of young women as they were paraded before him. And worse, it did not help anything that his mother had joined the bandwagon and was constantly and actively choosing girls for him that she thought would work for his marriage. "I shall marry," he would tell his mother, "very soon. Please do not rush me." At first, those words had been enough, but then, soon enough, his friends had begun to marry, and his mother was becoming more and more agitated by the day. "Soso's daughter is beautiful and strong and well-mannered. She is built, too, to carry sons, and you will have warriors in your home." But Farai had said to his mother, "I will think about it," and he thought about it until Soso's daughter married, then Ziso's daughter, then Beva's daughter, and he had begun to hear the increasing exasperation in his mother's voice. He sighed now as he walked home, choosing less trodden roads, but still he could not escape the young beauties that flocked his path. He saw them as he walked past them, their smiles broad, their eyes both shy and alluring, and he greeted them back and heard somewhere in the back of his mind their giggles, but his mind did not register them. It was as though his mind had erased every other woman it had ever seen, and all that sat in it was the beauty from the forest. He had to see her again, he knew, as he wondered what she was up to now and if she would even think about him back in her home. But Mucha was not thinking about the warrior from the forest at all as she methodically blew the dying fire in her grate and rushed around to prepare supper before it was dark. As their meal simmered by the fire, she called her daughter, Nyenyedzi, who at 10 had grown into a tall, lanky girl who resembled her departed father so much. Mucha watched as Nyenyedzi cleaned herself up before the girl came to sit beside her mother by the fire. The older woman tried to rein in the tears that had pooled in her eyes as she dished up their supper. Nyenyedzi was her father's splitting image. From the undefined lengths of their bodies to their loud, come from the bottom of the belly laughs, to the way they both shook their heads whenever they were trying to put a point across. The father might be gone forever, Mucha thought, as she handed the young girl her plate, but he had incarnated in his daughter. It had not been an easy marriage, and daily she had regretted marrying him. For while they had been friends when they were younger, in marriage they had been as good as passers-by. And what was worse was that it had not been the things that he had done to her or the words he had said to her that had made their marriage painful. No, it had been the words that had not been said and the things that had not been done in the marriage. He had waited for her to fall pregnant before he absented himself from the marriage and gone on to live a life separate from his and later his daughter's. He would of course appear home in the middle of the night, and she would hear him open pots and plates looking for his meal, and then you would let her settle down anyway for the night without even speaking to her. She had spent moons with longing causing sores in her heart, wondering to herself, where is the love? Where is the affection? Where is the attention that others have always said is a part of marriage? She heard of his exploits in the village through whispers and rumors. He is seeing a young woman from the neighboring kingdom, the rumors said. They arranged to meet in the forest every day by the river and spend all their time together. He cannot marry her because their clan forbids, so all he can do is these clandestine meetings. Mucha tried to confront him, but he had not said a word to her, but frowned before looking her up and down as though she were a frozen statue for womanhood, then returning to his plate of food. She had never asked again, and had then pretended to be a widow and channeled all her efforts towards her daughter. But the widow pretense had not taken long to become a reality, for one day a great whisper arose from within the kingdom of a man and his lover who had fallen at the hands of a crocodile in the river, and as the whispers grew, so too did the identities of the lovers, her husband and his foreign lover. She had tried not to breathe a sigh of relief throughout the funeral and burial proceedings, but deep inside, she felt a joy she had not felt for years, a reawakened rejuvenation, and another chance at life. She was rid of the man who had only been a husband in name. At least she had a daughter now, and she would concentrate all her energies on the young girl. She had known then, as she stood beside his grave and pretended to weep, that she would never marry again, never look at a man again, and that decision made her happy. But the moisture in the soil on her husband's grave had not dried when the elders in her husband's family convened a meeting to discuss the deceased family and his home in the family diary. Welcome everyone, the eldest uncle spoke as he stood in the space between the men who sat on stools on one side and the women who sat on reed mats on the other side. It was a bright morning, and Mucha's heart was feeling light, and she had been humming with joy all morning. She felt that nothing would disturb her peace. She now murmured greetings with everyone else as they greeted back the elder uncle. The older man did not waste time and said, "We are all gathered here to discuss what to do with the deceased home so that it does not die. The elders and I have already discussed amongst ourselves the tragedy that has befallen the home, but we are glad now that we have had to lean on our customs to find a solution." He now turned to Mucha and smiled slightly. "My daughter, we as the family are so sorry for your loss. However, as you know, your husband did not have an heir, and this has meant that his lineage has closed. But that is not so true, as you are his wife, and you are still alive, and you can bear sons for him." He paused for a while and drank water from a gourd before he turned to look at Mucha again. "Before I go any further, daughter-in-law, I want to draw your mind back to the day you were married. This family headed 10 heads of cattle into your family's kraal, and then for that bride price, they gave us you, and they assured us that you were here to help build our family home. That day, your husband did not come into your father's homestead alone, but he brought his family with him, meaning that you did not marry the man, but you also married the family, which means you owe us an obligation as a family, and that you are still our wife." He paused. "It is because of this we have decided to carry out the tradition of nhaka, where you and your child will be inherited by a male member of this family, and you will become his wife, in addition to the other wives he might have. Your husband had 4 older brothers, and you can choose any of these men to marry you. Any of them. the choice is yours. He finished with a small look at Mucha before he clicked his fingers and summoned someone sitting with the woman. An aunt rose and she grabbed a dish from the ground and came to kneel before Mucha. But then Mucha's heart was racing. She was trying to comprehend it all. How had she escaped from the clutches of one uninterested man only to find herself landing into the hands of a married man? She had thought she had finally escaped hell after her husband had passed, but this was proving to be a bigger hell because at least with her husband, they had liked each other when they had courted and she had wanted to marry him, but she did not wish to marry anyone imposed on her now. She did not even have time to voice her concerns out because the uncle was still speaking and to her now, directly looking into her defiant eyes. Murora, daughter-in-law, he said, accept that dish of water offered to you. Mucha sighed and complied. This was no place to fight, not with all these eyes looking at her. She then looked at her reflection in the water that jeered back at her as the uncle continued. You will now take that dish to any of your husband's brothers that you wish to marry. Should he wash his hands with the water, then yes, he can marry you. He then finished chuckling. See how fair our culture is, giving you an option and a choice to pursue your life. Lucky woman. Then with a sweep of his hand, he gestured for her to stand and approach the man she wanted. All eyes were on her as she stood on her shaky feet. She looked over at the brothers as she walked towards them, and she could see their leering gazes, and her heart fell. This was it, she sighed, and with her trembling legs, she took her dish to the first brother who sat on the furthest end of the row and knelt before him. For a second, he did not move, and Mucha almost thanked her ancestors for the refusal. But then his leering look turned grotesque as he opened his mouth to laugh before dipping both hands wrist deep into the dish. The family laughed, then ululated and whistled, and all Mucha could think about was how she had failed for the second time in marriage. She had just been fortunate that her new husband had stalled the marriage as it was farming season and he had 3 other wives. I will die of a broken back, he had laughed with the elders, so I will do my farming now, then after the harvest we can celebrate the union and she will officially be mine. Now the planting and weeding had been done and soon the early farmers would begin their harvest. Then she would marry again. Oh, my ancestors, she thought to herself now, as she watched her daughter Nyenyedzi clear her plate. Where is the true love I have always wanted? Where are the looks that cannot mask light and laughter and joy? Where are the arms that embrace until they wipe every tear and every burden just by themselves? Where is the giddiness that I am supposed to feel whenever I encounter my lover? Why am I getting all these men that I either do not care for or who do not care for me? Oh, my ancestors, if this love that I want is not available, why then do you force me into marriages? Why can't you not leave me alone? Why can't I stay alone as I have always done with my daughter even when I was married? But the ancestors were asleep and had left her to her own devices. A thought gripped her mind now as she watched Nyenyedzi clear up the plates and pots and cooking sticks used in making and eating the meal. What if I run away? She thought. But the thought had no sooner set in her mind than she had no sooner dismissed it. Where would they go? Her parents had passed when she was barely a toddler, and she had been raised by her older siblings. Now the siblings had their own lives, had cultivated respectability and were doing well. If she, Mucha, ran away, her entire family would be plunged into disrepute, and she did not want that. So she stayed, even though it was painful to her, even though she knew that each day that passed brought her closer to her new husband's home. It was like a noose sitting on her throat, with someone pushing the knot tighter and tighter, till she felt as though she was being suffocated. If only she could find or think of a way out. Meanwhile, back at his home, Farai could not keep the image of the woman out of his mind. He spoke with his family, who rejoiced at his return alive. He ate the food that was prepared for him. He joined in the laughter that flew around him, even though he had not heard the jokes. He was there with them physically, but his mind was back in the forest where he had met the beauty. He knew he had to see her again. So the following afternoon, he had made as if to go into the forest for a young hunt, but instead he walked by the edges of the forest, avoiding the people who knew him so that his journey towards the poor parts of the kingdom would not be questioned. He walked until he could feel the scent of the river, then took the route parallel to it until he could see the clusters of run-down homes and very small pens and poor-looking crops from his position in the forest. He found the path she had exited from and stood at its end, looking out for her, afraid to step in the village because he did not want to be seen, but also curious to see which direction she had taken. He had stood there for a long while, looking out before inspiration struck him. What if he went to the place he had first seen her? And promptly he turned and retraced his steps back to the glade where they had first met. But she was not there, and his heart sank. He wondered whether he would be able to find her again someday. He was not dejected for long, however, as inspiration struck again. He was sure that she would come back again here some day soon, so he began to gather fruits and nuts in the trees surrounding the glade, and these he put in a small knapsack before placing them by the log she had been sitting on. He stood again, waiting for a while, then left. Farai did not return until the following day, and he found the knapsack of fruits and nuts gone. He would only hope that it had been her, and it was not a baboon or a monkey that had taken it. But the place had always been so hidden that he was sure not many people knew about it. So again, he gathered some fruits and nuts, and this time added the chunk of dried buffalo he had brought. He had errands to run, so he did not stay for long, and left. And again, when he returned a day later, the bag was gone. He would wait for some time, but being a warrior and a hunter, and learning that there were skirmishes with the neighboring kingdom where the army at alert, and he had to show up at work, he would have wanted to see her again, but he hoped that at least she was the one getting the food he was leaving behind. Meanwhile, the skirmishes were growing stronger, and a week later, as Farai and the rest of the army sat in their forest camp with the commander, strategizing on the best courses of action to retaliate as they did not want to start a fight, an ambush happened. There was no warning. The enemy came with silent and nimble feet and carried out an attack so swift, Farai and the rest of the army hardly had any time to respond. They slew the sentinel first, quietly and quickly, before pouncing on the rest of the army. Farai, whose back was to them, was listening to his commander as the men spoke, and his first sense of danger was the commander's eyes that had almost popped out of their sockets. Farai turned, and a host of young, tough men were behind them, their faces marked with both fierceness and thirst. He reached for his spear that was by his side, but already the intruders were upon them, and mercilessly so. Farai had no time to attack, but all he had was a slight opportunity to defend himself, and he tried his best. Around him, too, he could see his compatriots flailing, fighting for space, for air, for an escape, but the enemy had an advantage and was coming heavy on them. From somewhere behind him, as he tried to fight off the warrior that was pinning him to the ground, Farai heard his commander's voice, loud and clear as it said, "Men of Gara, the enemy is too heavy for us. Don't fight back. Flee. Now, run." Farai heard footsteps, the rushing sound of feet that took any direction. He tried to rise, but now there were two men with ugly grins hovering over him, waving their weaponry in the air. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, wondering whether he should just give up, But there in his mind, the image of the beautiful woman he had seen by the glade flashed before him. If he gave up now, he thought to himself, then he would never see her again. The thought was enough to lend him superhuman strength, and he heaved himself up against the two men who were holding him down. His muscles remembered the celebrated warrior that he was, and they cooperated enough to fend off his attackers. As he fought, he looked around and realized that the rest of the army had fled. He was alone with the enemy, and besides the two men who fought him, 3 others stood watching, the glee of possible victory written on their faces. Farai fought like a demented man, standing his ground and using his hands as he had lost his spear somewhere in the melee. He knew that he did not have time, and all he wanted was just 3 breaths to escape and follow his fellow soldiers home. And the opportunity arrived, because as he defended himself against one of the fighters with a strong arm that gripped the fighting hand so tight the spear clattered to the ground, he used his foot to kick the groin of the other opponent, then ducked a spear from the spectators and ran for his life. But he had almost cleared the enemy when he felt a sharp pain in his shin. He staggered to look, and a dagger was stuck there. Hoping it was not poisonous, he ran on, hiding behind trees and using untrodden paths to flee. He neither stopped nor turned for a glimpse behind, ignoring the dull ache in his shin and the lifeblood that gushed out of the wound. He ran without thinking of where he was going, but at some point he began to feel himself losing all his strength, and he knew that it was because of the blood loss that was excessive. He became afraid. What if he passed on in this forest, far away from the paths that humans trod? What if his remains were mauled by wild beasts and cheetahs and lions? What if this vast forest became his grave, and he passed as though he had no family? This thought spurred him on further as he tried to find a path that he would pass in, so his body would be discovered. He willed his powerless body to run, and then he saw a stream and he followed it, knowing it would lead him to some human habitation. Then he stumbled into a glade, and it took him a moment to remember that he had been here before. Instinctively, he raised his eyes, and there, sitting on a log and startled at the intrusion, was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. His beautiful woman. A smile spread across his lips, but dizziness washed through him, and he felt himself fall and fall and fall into a deep, bottomless pit. Muchai had recognized the young man as immediately as he had entered the glade, and her first reaction was a frown of, "No, not him again." She had been holding a fruit that she had found in the knapsack that the stranger had always left behind, and was about to bite into it when the intrusion occurred. But when he had fallen into a heap on the ground, she did not even think twice or blink, but threw the fruit onto the ground and ran off towards him. She saw the blade in his foot, and the trickle that now slowly seeped out of his wound. She knew she could not take the hilt out yet, because the flow would worsen, and she stood for a long moment, her mind utterly blank as she wondered what next to do. Her sister had known some herbs, and had rubbed poultices and potions on them when they were young and had been wounded. Now Mucha knew she had to find these herbs that helped stem blood flow. She had sat in this glade enough times to know where every shrub and every tree and every wild plant was. She needed the sap of the sese plant, and she bent to the ground to look for them. When she found them, she broke a couple of stems and rushed back to the man. Quickly, she dipped the sap around the edges of the hilt and then ran back to get some more. She made trips, and on the 4th trip, she was sure that the trickle had stopped. Now she needed to remove the dagger, because if it remained there, it would likely lead to an infection. So she made a sponge of grass and leaves, and tore some stems off the sese plant, and packed the sponge with the sap. When she was satisfied, she returned to the man again and saw that the trickle had completely stopped, even though he remained unconscious, and she could not give him the haranati fruit to revive him. She muttered a prayer to her ancestors. Then, with all the strength she could muster, she grabbed the yield, then quickly replaced it with the pegged sponge, pressing the sponge into the wound. She sat there for a long while until she was satisfied that she had stopped the flow completely, and when she removed the sponge, there was no flow, just the gaping of the wound, and Mucha was relieved that she had arrested the blood. But she was concerned about his shallow breathing and his unconscious state. She was sure he had lost a lot of blood and needed some strength in his body. The kind stranger had left some haranati in the knapsack and slowly crushed the pods to get some of the juices. She went back to the man, then with her fingers parted his mouth and poured some, then some more, then another sip until the mixture was finished. When she was done, she sat up and looked around her, startled. It was late afternoon. She had to go back home and prepare food for her supper, yet here she was, helping a strange man. A part of her wanted to leave him and go and find help in the village, but she knew that would draw questions as to what a woman was doing in a forest alone, given her husband's forest affair. Another part of her told her to leave. She had already done her part, and whether he survived or succumbed was beyond her hands. She would sleep away tomorrow to see if he had survived the night or if he had been mauled by an animal. But for now, what was pressing was that she got back home. With resolve in her heart, she stood and placed the knapsack of food closer to the man. She also placed the dagger that had been stuck in his shin in his line of vision, so that should he find himself in danger, he might be able to fight. Then she placed her hand on his wrist to feel his pulse, and was it a figment of her imagination, or was it stronger now? Nevertheless, she made to rise, but then his hand turned to her wrist and clasped it lightly. Startled again, she looked up at his eyes and said, smiling, "You are awake." But his eyes were dazed and far off, and all he said weakly was, "Please don't go. Don't leave me alone." And his eyes flapped shut again while his hand fell off her wrist. She waited agitatedly for a while as she watched him, hoping his eyes would open again and that she would ask him where he came from so she could send word. But he did not stir again, and a part of her began to despair. She had to go home, and glancing at the horizon, she could see the last sliver of the sun disappearing. She prayed one line to both her ancestors and his ancestors and said, "Keep watch over him," then released him and sprang to her feet, rushing back home. She found Nyenyedzi frantic with worry, but was grateful that the girl had not raised the alarm with the elders. Otherwise, it would have become a hullabaloo already. They prepared supper, Mucha listening to the beautiful drone of her daughter's voice as the young girl retold stories of what she and her friends had been up to during the day. But even as Mucha hadn't responded, her mind was far away. Had he woken up? Had he eaten? Had he not been attacked by a wild animal? Had he lived even? These thoughts continued to taunt her as they prepared for bed and eventually as they slept. But sleep eluded Mucha. She watched the rise and fall of Nyenyedzi's chest for a long time. Then at last she heaved and sat up. Nyenyedzi was a deep sleeper, and no noise or movement could wake her up. With that in mind, and with a serious prayer on Nyenyedzi's deep sleep to continue and her patient's recovery, she stood, then packed some equipment to help her care for the patient before she quietly slipped out of the hut and into the moonlit night. She pulled her skins tighter and checked to see if anyone was watching, and finding no one, she rushed out and ran to the forest, where she took a deep breath. She retraced her steps to the glade, walking as swiftly as she could, and trying not to be scared of the sounds of the forest in the middle of the night. When she got to the glade, she was startled because he was no longer lying down, but he was sitting and resting his body on the log. He looked up quickly at the sound of feet, but relaxed just as quickly when he recognized her. "I dreamt you took care of me," he said, his voice weary and quiet. She came to sit before him and saw the tiredness in his posture. Then she said, a small smile on her face, "I am glad you are awake. Do you think I should help you now to go back home?" He shook his head. "I am so tired. I could hardly drag myself to sit here, let alone begin the trek home." She nodded. "Of course," she said, "you need some food and water." She unpacked her flask and went to the stream where she filled it and brought some for Farai. She began collecting small twigs, and once she had piled them up, she struck a match and put some water to boil. As she began preparing the meal, she looked up at the injured man, who was staring at her so intently that she blushed when their eyes met. But then she quickly asked, "What is your name? Where do you come from?" "Farai," he said, and then he proceeded to tell her his family names and totems. She knew immediately who he was, and she asked, "Oh, I've heard of your great prowess. How did you become injured?" Again he explained to her, and she said, "Your family must be worried." He nodded too, then laughed, "Which is why I think it will be a lovely surprise for them when I get back home." She shrugged and continued preparing her meal. He then asked her who she was, and she responded, "My nyenyedzi." "What?" he said, shocked at her response. "You are married? Where does your husband think you are now? What does he think you are up to during the afternoons when you are here?" "No," she said, "I am not married, though I was some time ago. But then my husband passed away during Chirimo in winter, and I became widowed. But now I am betrothed through nhaka to marry my husband's brother, and I'll marry after the harvest." They were quiet for a while before Farai spoke. "You don't sound excited about it." She sighed and said, "I am not." Then, as though someone had unlocked her heart, she began speaking all the words she had hid in her heart since the family meeting. She told him the unfairness of it all. She told him of how she had ideated with running away from home, but how only the safety and sanity of her child had kept her in the homestead, waiting for the day that the chains would be placed on her wrists. When she was done, he said to her, "I am sorry, my nyenyedzi. Why though are you averse to marrying your husband's brother?" "I don't love him," she said. "My marriage was horrible, and I fear that if I marry his older brother, I will still have a difficult marriage. I don't want that for myself anymore." She was quiet for a while, then laughed and said, "You know, when I was young, I wanted to be loved. I thought and believed that love was real and that one day I would find it. And when I married my husband, I thought that the experience was about to begin." She sighed as she finished transferring the meal to a plate and grabbed a chunk of meat from the stranger's knapsack before she handed it to Farai. "There is no love," she finished. Farai could still feel the tiredness in his limbs as he accepted the plate, and then wearily he started eating. He had eaten 2 morsels when he asked her, "What is love to you, my nyenyedzi?" Mucha did not hesitate, but smiled and looked up at the moon as though it were a source of inspiration. Then she said, "Love for me is the intention to love that comes from an understanding that the world has its challenges, and yet, in spite of it all, I choose to be wholeheartedly with this person. Love is the intention to be kind to your partner and understanding what could hurt them, and then being intentional in protecting them from that. Love for me is the intention to create a safe space for each other, far from the world beyond your control, far from the wolves, the droughts, the in-laws' opinions. Love for me is softness. Love for me is calmness. Love for me is both vulnerability and strength." She was quiet and remained staring at the moon for a while, the smile still on her face while Farai continued to look at her with a dazed expression. Then she burst out laughing and looked at him and said, "That no longer exists for me, never did, never will, and I have come to accept that. But maybe for you, you are still young and you are a man. You get to choose. You could find love. You are still young too, he said. How old are you? I am old, huh? I have seen 34 rains. I have seen too much. How old are you? I have seen 25 rains, he said, and I have also experienced a lot in my life. War, animal maulings, parental disappointment. I'm grown, okay? She laughed, then said, if you say so, before proceeding to check on his wound, which was clean now, but which she knew needed an expert healer to help prevent infection. You watched her at her ministrations, feeling her scent whenever she drew closer, and he wished that they had met under different circumstances. As he forced himself to swallow one morsel after the other, he knew that the first impression he had had of her was pure and honest. She was not only beautiful and lovely, she was also kind, sacrificing censure in her homestead were she to be caught coming here to serve a dying man. She also had managed to cultivate and maintain a beautiful aura around her despite the misfortune that had followed her in her marital life. He knew that this was the woman he wanted to be with, to spend time with, to be around. This was the woman he wanted, notwithstanding the stories around her. He finished his meal and he watched as she went to the stream to wash her utensils. He was no longer feeling as weary, but he still felt woozy and knew that he would not be able to stand without keeling over, so he remained in his position. When she came back, he willed himself not to fall asleep because he wanted to look at her again and again and etch her image further into his mind. They spoke of her daughter and their life, and he spoke of his work in the army and his dreams of becoming army commander one day. They spoke until the moon disappeared and Mucha packed up. Are you sure I should not send word to your family that you are alive? She asked him. Yes, he said. I would rather leave this place when I can walk on my own. Besides, it might put a spotlight on you as people may wonder how you came to know of my whereabouts. She shrugged, then said, That's okay. I have left some food in that covered plate beside you, and there are fruits and some meat in the knapsack. You try too. But she was interrupted by his chuckles and his following words. You found the knapsacks? He asked. She was puzzled for a while, then realization dawned. Of course, the anonymous giver had to be him, for the gift had started after they had met accidentally in the glade. Why? She asked him now. Did I look poor to you that you decided to leave food for me? No, he said quickly, noticing how quickly her expression had become hard. Not at all. I just wanted to leave something nice for you. He took a deep breath, then continued. That first day I saw you here, I was drawn to you immediately. I have never been one for strong sentiments, particularly when it comes to women, but that first time I saw you, I think a part of me fell in love with you. Mucha did not know whether to laugh or chastise the young man, for she was momentarily stunned. Then she gave in and laughed. Oh, Farai, poor you! Falling for an old woman like me when there are thousands dying for you to look their way in the streets. I am glad you have seen me now, and you realize how unrealistic your initial impression of me was. She laughed even harder, but Farai did not laugh. Instead, in a serious voice, and looking straight into Mucha's eyes, he said, In fact, I have fallen for you. I have come to love you, especially tonight after you and I have spent time together. I want to be with you. And when he saw her eyes faltering, he quickly added, Please, Mucha. Mucha looked at the horizon where streaks of dawn were beginning to show, and she sighed heavily. She had to be back at home before people awoke, but she also had to settle this matter. So looking at him directly, she said, Oh, Farai, it seems you did not listen to anything I said. In what world do you think you and I would work? We come from different backgrounds. You are wealthy and I am poor. I am a woman. You are a boy. I have been married. You have not been. I have a child. You have none. Who in their right mind would sanction a marriage between the two of us? Look, she said, now standing up. I'm going to forgive and forget all you've said and put it down to delirium. I'm rushing back home now, and I'll try to come later to see you, okay? If you start bleeding again, she said, pointing to a sponge wet with the sap, use that to stem the flow. Goodbye, and do rest and do eat. And she did not put any more thought to what he had said. The last thing she wanted to do was complicate her already heavy life. When she returned later, she found him up and about. He had fashioned a walking stick from a tree branch and was walking, although each step was accompanied by a painful wind. Relief washed through his face when he saw her, and she smiled too. Her patient was getting better. He agreed for her to accompany him to the edge of the forest now, and he would limp for the rest of the way home. He was sure he would be able to find help then. But he did not simply agree, instead almost bargaining with her to allow space for him in his heart or he would not go home. But she had been adamant that there was neither space in her heart nor space in the world that would take care of the possibility of the two of them being together. Eventually, he gave up and allowed her to lead him to the peripheries of the forest. When they got there, he looked at her and smiled and said, I am glad that I found you that day. It was the universe's way of making sure I would know where to find help during times of trouble. She looked up at him and smiled. It was so true, and she told him that she was glad too she had been in the right place at the correct time. He then opened his arms, letting go of his walking stick and exposing his broad chest to her, and without further prompting, she walked into the softest, sweetest, and most heartfelt hug she had ever experienced. He held on longer than was expected decorum, and Mucha too made no attempt to step back. And when he whispered in her ear, "You are beautiful. I love you," she almost melted into his skin. A fleeting thought told her this was where she wanted to be forever, but reasonability returned, and she gently extricated herself. Then, avoiding his gaze in case he could see the flash in her eyes, she picked up his walking stick, bade him farewell, wished him a speedy recovery, and shooed him off before she stood and watched him disappear into his village. However, even as they returned to their lives, the longing was palpable for the both of them. For Mucha, it was the parting hug she could not get out of her mind. She could not remember whether, even in the first days of her marriage, she had ever felt so safe with a man. Plenty of times during the day, and most especially at night, she would find herself distracted as she thought of him, and a small smile would play on her lips as she remembered his proposal. Oh, it felt good to be wanted, but she also knew it would be unrealistic to pursue more. So she had stopped going to the glade, and she remained at home, knowing fully well that the invisible walls of her late husband's home would deter him from trying to see her again. To her, he was as good as a fantasy, as a daydream and nothing more, and she was content with that. For Farai, on the other hand, the times he could not spend with Mucha were agony. Yes, his family, who had already set up a funeral tent for him, had quickly dismantled it and celebrated his return. Yes, he was recuperating under the care of the best herb doctor in 5 kingdoms, but his heart was in a deep pain. When he was not thinking of how she smiled, or how she talked, or her quiet sashaying step, he was wondering what he could do to circumvent the cultural and filial expectations of marrying a woman who had a child. There was no solution. All you knew was that he needed to see her again. They saw each other sooner than Mucha had expected. Knowing that the harvest was drawing closer, Farai had known he had needed to act, so he had explained to his family of the stranger he had met and who had saved his life. "We have to thank her for her kindness," he suggested, and his parents had quickly arranged for a beast to give as the gift. Mucha was shelling peanuts with Nyenyedzi under the eaves of their hut when a nephew came running with the news that she was needed at the dairy. Her heart immediately sank as the first thought that struck her mind was that the new husband was ready to marry. But she was not prepared for the shock that sat in the family cot, for there Farai was, sitting with a grin on his face. Only when she learned that Farai had lied and said she had seen him lying on the ground as she fetched firewood did she relax. And the cow, which was then immediately headed into her new husband's kraal, further endeared the family to Farai's family. Later, after lunch had been served for the visitors, and now people were eating and mingling, did Farai draw closer to her and whisper, "Please meet me tomorrow in our glade, please," before he walked off. It became the first of many meetings between the two of them in the ensuing days. As she had always done, Mucha would slip away from her homestead, pretending she was fruit gathering or looking for firewood, and then once she was out of sight, she would walk to the glade. The first day she had gone after his invite, a part of her had felt stupid for listening to a young man, old as she was, but the giddiness of meeting him again spurred her on, and he was already there when she arrived, his eyes wide open, his arms wide open, and she rushed into them, wanting to remember how it felt to be within his arms again. Only this time his embrace came from a healthy man, and it was more robust and yet equally gentle and sweet. They sat on the log and spoke about your daughter, about his leg which still limped, about her impending marriage, about the battle that still raged with their neighbors, and how Farai could not join until he had fully recuperated. As they spoke, they would shift closer and closer to each other until their thighs and knees touched. He would brush a stray hair from her face, and she would lean over on his shoulders as she laughed. And in those moments, the whole world, besides the two of them, ceased to exist. The first afternoon, he had given her a gift, an intricate gold chain, and said, "I never got to thank you personally for saving my life. I can't imagine what would have happened to me had you not been there, and this chain here is a symbol of my gratitude. Thank you, Mucha." And he had helped her to clasp the chain on her throat. For Mucha, the chain felt heavy, and she knew it was because she had never received a golden gift before. A part of her had wanted to refuse her, but his expression had been so serious, so full of meaning that she had only said, "Thank you," and allowed the chain to beat in tandem with her pulse. She knew she would never be able to wear it anyway, as it would evoke curiosity, for everyone knew she would never afford a gift this beautiful, and she knew she would need to hide it. And then she went back to reveling in the moments she spent with Farai. The mid-mornings they met sped by, but by late afternoon, reality would rear again, and Mucha would be the first to sigh, to stand up, and question herself why a married woman like her was spending time with a younger man, and the self-chastisement would begin. And no matter how many times she told herself she would not come back, she would always find herself back here, for she felt safe with the man. But unbeknownst to Mucha, back at home, a plot had arisen. It arose not because of her disappearances, but because of her smile. Her younger sister-wife-to-be had been the first to remark on it. "Where have you ever seen a widow smile and grin like that? Huh? When it was said that she would be married again, she looked as though she would die on the spot. But now she walks with a bounce, and she is always humming. I think she is up to something." And those words had brought further scrutiny and observation to Mucha. Women around the homestead began to watch her, signaling at each other whenever she smiled when alone and when she hummed or whistled a happy tune, until people began noticing her disappearances, the times she left and the times she returned. You cannot tell me that that is all the firewood that she brought back after all the time she spent in the forest, the commenters would say, shocked. That little bag of fruits for a disappearance of a whole afternoon? No, this woman is up to something. At first, the women said, let's follow her, but nobody could commit to spending time investigating in the forest. Then someone suggested, let's search her heart while she's away. One afternoon, as Mucha hummed her way back into the forest, she was astonished to find the family sitting in the dairy, seemingly waiting. She dropped her knapsack of fruits by her door, then tentatively walked closer, and then her heart fell when she saw what was in the elder uncle's hands, the necklace that Farai had given her. She walked, she saw all accusing eyes staring at her, challenging her, and she wondered how much they knew. She sat down in her customary seat and waited. When the elder stood, his cold eyes were fixated on her, and she shivered. He spoke with no preamble, but just spoke as though she had been made aware of the issue prior. Whose is this? He asked, holding the exquisite chain up. Mucha did not respond because she did not know if perhaps someone had followed her and had seen her with Farai. But when the elder spoke again and asked, do you have a lover? Mucha knew they did not know, since they would have ousted her. So again she remained mum. The elder asked again and again, do you have a lover? Are you cheating on your new husband? Where did you get this? And still Mucha said nothing. She said nothing as the other wives in the families whispered and sniggered and then jeered. She was ashamed, of course, of what she had done. Yes, but the beauty of it all had been beautiful. When later the meeting had been adjourned with no resolution, except that she would be officially taken to her new husband's home by the end of the week, and the elder had confiscated the chain, claiming that he would not give it back until she spoke, Mucha had sighed in relief and gone back to her heart. She knew that she would forever cherish the memories of hers and Farai that for the briefest of moments she had experienced. She now had to return to reality, and there was no need to go back to the glade again. The memories would have to do. Farai waited for Mucha the following day, at first with a feverish anticipation, then as the sun rose higher with some concern, and as it tilted westward with apprehension. He limped around the perimeter of the glade, at times going into the path she used, and she was not there. Where was she? He wondered. They had of course not fought, and their parting yesterday had been sweet and amicable. So what was the reason behind her not showing up? The sun set, and still she was no show. He hoped that everything was all right with her, and she had been tied up with work and she would show up the following day. He did not even attempt to entertain thoughts of her being married off already. He loved her. He wanted to be with her. He wanted to spend forever with her. He wanted to marry her. Only if he could find the means of convincing his parents it was her he wanted to marry. Later, after the sun had set, he gave up, and dejected, he walked home. Maybe she would turn up tomorrow. But she did not, and did not turn up the day after either, and when finally she had not turned up on the fourth day, he knew he had to act. He knew her home now, as they had been there for the gift-giving, and he knew her heart too. So he waited until nightfall, and thanked the universe for the cloud cover that made the night darker, and tiptoed into the homestead, hoping that they did not own dogs. The entire household was asleep, and he was thankful as he made a beeline towards her heart. He got to the window and rapped lightly, while peering to see if there was anyone in, but he could see nothing. Mucha first heard the knocks as though in her dreams, but as they became more and more consistent, she roused. Sleepily, She stood and went to gaze out the window, and for a long moment she thought her dream was continuing as she watched Farai's face framed in the darkness of the window, grinning back at her. Thankful that Nyenyedzi was spending the night with her cousins, Mucha rushed to open the door and literally pulled Farai in. Once closeted inside, they hugged each other, rushes of excitement and fear rushing in Mucha's entire body. "What are you doing here?" she asked, extricating herself from the hug and looking at him to see if he was real before falling back into his arms. But Farai had not even opened his mouth to respond when the door behind them was banged open and both Mucha and Farai jumped apart, alarmed. Standing before them was the elder uncle, holding a large kettle whip, and a host of other faces who were peering into the hut to see what was happening. Mucha had not even had time to experience fear when the elder spoke. "Oh, so this is the person who gave you the golden chain. You have been exchanging yourself for trinkets, huh? An entire family wife, partaking in despicable, diabolical behaviors, huh? What is this, my Nyenyedzi?" Behind him, Mucha could hear the shouts of, "Shameless woman! You drove your husband to cheat. This is what you have been up to all this time, pretending to be a good woman when you are a snake. I told you she is up to no good. Two-faced woman. Look at the boy too. She is taking advantage of a young man." But the elder uncle's voice was louder than everyone else's. "Take her," he said to the crowd. "Drag them to the dairy so that they answer for their actions." And two burly young men shoved through the growing crowd to grab the perpetrators. Farai was, however, quick, jumping to stand between Mucha and the crowd. He spoke with the assertive voice of a warrior that everyone stopped in their tracks. "No one drags my woman anyway." There was a stunned silence as everyone realized that a stranger had spoken out in their home. The elder uncle was the first to respond. "Who are you, boy? And what potion has she concocted for you to make leave of your senses?" Farai spoke again and said, "I am her lover, and I am willing to marry you." "You want to marry this old, useless woman? A vital young man like you, who can have the most beautiful woman at his service, this is your choice?" But Farai neither flinched nor moved, but instead spoke in his commanding voice. "I am sorry to the elders of this home for transgressing your home. I know too that my beloved was to marry, so I know that is another transgression. But now I want to settle this issue here and finish it now. What is my charge for those crimes?" The elder uncle stared into the young man's eyes and said, "As the elder of the family, I want 30 cows, but my nephew will come and say his charge for taking his wife." Mucha's husband-to-be confidently stepped to the front and said, "I want 40 cows. Mucha almost gasped, but Farai clasped her hand before speaking. "Very well then. I accept the charges, and for that I will get my wife. I would also like you to remember our saying that when one drags a branch, he drags the leaves with it too. So I would like to live with my new daughter." Nobody objected. She was a girl after all. Mucha knew that they were already salivating at the prospect of fertile cow pens. They then camped outside Mucha's door, watching her peck and waiting for the morning when she would leave. For Mucha, however, there was a lot of trepidation in her mind. Yes, she had not been shamed, then publicly banished by her late husband's family, but who was to know what waited for her in Farai's homestead? Would his parents accept her, knowing the baggage she carried? Would his family acknowledge her, being older than Farai as she was? What if they too turned her away? Where would she go? Mucha was right to have worried, for as immediately as they had entered Farai's homestead and he had announced his intentions to marry, his parents' faces, which had been wide open with welcoming smiles, had quickly fallen in both disbelief and disappointment. They had not chastised him, but his father had stood, then shook his head and left without welcoming words to his new daughter-in-law. However, his mother remained dumbfounded in his seat. Then, after a while, she too spoke. "I have never felt so disappointed in you before, my son," she said, looking directly at Mucha. "There are thousands of girls more beautiful than she is, and with more respectability to their names than she does, and yet this is who you choose? Are you blind? Are you foolish? Did she perhaps give you a love potion while she was nursing you back to health, huh?" She looked at Mucha all over before she said, "What made you choose an old, tired, overused hag for a wife?" "Because I love her," Farai said. "Love?" His mother piped up and cackled. "What do you know about love? You who still has snot on his nose." Then she looked again at Mucha, and with as much disdain in her voice as she could muster, she said, "Look at her. She has no juice in her left, and yet you want to marry her." She clapped her hands in the air and stood up to leave. Then at the door she turned back again and said, "Return her from where she came from. There is no space for her in my home." And then she left. Mucha looked up at Farai with fear in her eyes. "Maybe it will be better if we leave," she said. "I don't want to come here and destroy the relationship that you have with your parents." Farai looked at her and smiled before he took her hands in his. "Look, I know my parents. They will get over it. Besides, even if they do not, you and I can go and start our family somewhere. I am not letting you and Nyenyedzi go. Not after all I have fought to be with you. No, relax. It shall be fine." But it seemed as if there was a funeral in the homestead, Mucha observed from her window after Farai had settled them in his cozy, cushy hut. Everyone seemed to be in mourning, and even the dogs were drooping their heads in shame. Mucha shivered. She would have been much better off with her late husband's brother than being here where there was so much hostility in the air. Later that day, the family convened a dare that everyone was summoned to. Mucha and Farai were made to sit in front where everyone could see them. And again, as in Mucha's old marital home, an older uncle was chairing the meeting. "Family," he said, "today we woke up to Mashura, a shame in the home. Our beloved son, one whom we had placed our hopes and trusts in, the future in, brought in a strange woman into our homestead and said he would marry her. We do not know this woman. We don't know where she comes from. We don't know how she and my nephew courted. All we know is she was married before and that she has a child and that she is way older than our nephew. We have spent the day talking to the boy, asking him to return his guest from wherever you took her, but he is adamant that she is who he loves. We have no idea anymore of what to do with him, but we have agreed that he will have to start his home elsewhere with no blessing or word from us. But before we execute this decision, we would like to hear what you all have to say and if you have alternative ideas." As he spoke, Farai had slid his hand into Mucha's, and when she had stolen a glance at him, he had winked back at her. But she couldn't smile, as his stomach was aching with fear and trepidation. Farai's mother was the first to stand, and speaking in a loud, angry voice, she said, "The woman must be banished and leave. Why should my son be punished for swallowing a love potions, huh? No, call a herb doctor now, so he vomits, because I have never seen him capable of such folly before. No, she should be the one leaving, not my son." "But your son refuses to leave her alone," the uncle said. "If she goes, will you accept that your son lives too?" "No, never!" she shouted, her head shaking vehemently. Then she turned to Farai and said, "You want to betray me, your mother, the woman who carried you for months and months? You want to do your thing and leave me alone, huh?" Then she held her chest and said, "I fed you. I gave you my own juices so you would live. And yet you thank me with a woman as old as I am." Then she charged towards Mucha, fist raised in the air. "And you witch, who do you think you are, coming into my house and corrupting my son? Mucha, and Mucha closed her eyes as she prepared herself for the blow that was sure to come. Nothing came, and it seemed as though the air had suspended for a brief second. Slowly, Mucha opened her eyes to see a prospective mother-in-law hovering over her, but another hand was clasping her fist. It was Farai's father who held the feast, restraining his wife. Then after she had acquiesced, he took her hand and grasped it firmly, then began to speak, his voice soft, yet loud enough to be heard by everyone. "Remember, my love," he said, "when we started and when we fell in love, you were a foreigner. My family was against me marrying you. They didn't like your ways. They thought you would make me forget my roots. They thought you were here for the comfort and the security. But we had to fight for our love. Daily. We believed in our love, and in turn they came to believe in us too. If we had not fought to be together, we would not have had these wonderful years together. Look, I understand your hurt, and I understand your concerns, but I think we should give them our blessing and give them a chance. Perhaps in each other they will find the love that we too found in each other." Farai's mother looked over at Mucha, then sighed. Mucha could see the understanding that came in her eyes and the mellowing of her body and her stance. She then closed her eyes for a while, then finally breathed out, "It's okay." There was a poetry celebration from the crowd who still could not understand why Farai had chosen an old, once married mother to be his wife. But neither Farai nor Mucha noticed. Instead, they looked into each other's eyes and grinned. Their story was about to begin. The end. Thank you for listening and watching all the way to the end of this very long story. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please leave a thumbs up or a comment or a subscription. And also, if you've not watched the other stories on this channel, please do check them out. I promise you they are all interesting and exciting. And also do share with your friends. See you soon in the next folk tale. Lots of love. Bye.